I am Liam. I am 35 years old. And exactly 3 years ago, I stood in the absolute center of a breathtakingly expensive, crystal-lit hotel ballroom and watched my own flesh and blood throw me out like a piece of worthless garbage. As I stood there in my tailored navy suit, the soft hum of the string quartet completely died away, replaced by a suffocating, dead silence. My father stepped forward, the ice clinking in his scotch glass. He looked me up and down, his face twisted in absolute disgust, and sneered, "Get this beggar out." His voice was loud, sharp, and cruel, echoing over the 50 wealthy guests. I looked desperately to my mother for help, but she deliberately turned her head, refusing to make eye contact. My older brother, Julian, stood just behind them, his lips curled into that familiar, arrogant smirk. He had won again. The security guard stepped up, his face flushed with embarrassment, and aggressively gripped my arm in front of everyone. But there was one massive, catastrophic secret they did not know. The very ballroom they were standing in, the gourmet food on their porcelain plates, the vintage champagne they were drinking, and the luxury beach condo they loved to brag about as their grand inheritance. I owned all of it. Every single cent of their perfect, high-society lifestyle was funded by my company. And with a few taps on my phone, they were about to lose everything. Before I tell you how I burned their perfect illusion to the ground, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And don't forget to let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the moment everything shattered. The words hit me like physical blows, knocking the air straight out of my lungs. Get this beggar out. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum, flip a table, or beg for mercy. When you spend your entire life being conditioned to absorb your family's toxicity, your body goes into a strange, detached sort of autopilot. I felt the security guard's thick fingers digging into the expensive wool of my suit jacket. I could smell the heavy, overpowering cologne of my father mingling with the scent of roasted duck and expensive lilies that decorated the room. I straightened my back, adjusted my cuffs with agonizing slowness, and looked the security guard dead in the eye. I gave him a single, sharp nod, signaling that I did not need to be dragged out like an animal. I turned around and walked out with my dignity completely intact. My dress shoes echoed against the pristine marble floors of the Grand Plaza Hotel lobby. Every single step I took away from that extravagant ballroom was a step away from the pathetic, desperate boy who just wanted his parents to love him. I walked past the concierge desk, past the towering floral arrangements, and pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors into the freezing night air. The walk to the parking garage felt like wading through wet concrete. The air grew colder and heavier as I descended the concrete ramp to level B. The smell of exhaust, old oil, and damp concrete filled my lungs. I found my car parked in the corner, a quiet, unassuming sedan that betrayed absolutely nothing about my actual salary or net worth. I unlocked the door, the chirp of the alarm sounding deafening in the empty garage. I slid into the driver's seat and pulled the heavy door shut, sealing myself inside a quiet, insulated bubble. That was the exact moment the adrenaline finally crashed. My hands began to shake violently against the cold leather steering wheel. My chest tightened so incredibly hard I thought my ribs were going to snap. I could barely pull air into my lungs. My own flesh and blood. My own father. He had looked at me as if I were a disease. I took a deep, jagged breath. I did not cry. The time for tears had passed many, many years ago, buried under mountains of unpaid invoices and ungrateful demands. Instead, I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my phone. I opened my banking app, the harsh blue light illuminating the dark, quiet interior of the car. It was time to permanently resign from my position as the family ATM. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen. First on the chopping block was the venue. I navigated to the corporate portal for my LLC. There it was, the banquet catering, the string quartet, the absurdly expensive champagne fountain my mother insisted was absolutely essential for her social standing. Cancelled. The app processed the request, and a staggering $7,200 was immediately reversed back into my corporate account. Next was the airline portal. Julian and his demanding wife were flying out the very next morning for their luxury honeymoon in the Maldives. I had booked those non-refundable, first-class tickets directly on my corporate card because Julian claimed his credit limit was maxed out from the wedding. Voided. $12,000 wiped out in a fraction of a second. I could already imagine the look on the ticketing agent's face when Julian tried to check his bags. Then came my mother's extravagant spa weekend with her country club friends. She claimed the trip was an absolute necessity for her mental health, a supposed doctor-recommended retreat to deal with her stress. Terminated. $4,800 instantly reclaimed. Finally, the crown jewel of their entire existence. The monthly payments for their beloved beach condo. The premium real estate they paraded around to their friends as proof of their high-class status, claiming it was an inheritance from a distant relative. I went straight into the automatic transfer settings. Delete. $52,000 in upcoming annual HOA fees, maintenance, and mortgage payments, completely and permanently frozen. I sat back against the headrest, staring at the screen until my vision blurred. Over $70,000 of my hard-earned money, reclaimed in less than 5 minutes. They honestly thought they were humiliating a helpless beggar, but they had just violently evicted the landlord of their entire existence. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the garage, the tires squealing slightly against the pavement as I merged onto the empty highway. The storm was rapidly approaching, and for the first time in my 35 years on this earth, I was not going to be the one desperately seeking shelter. I was going to be the hurricane. But the ugly truth is, this catastrophic betrayal did not just happen overnight. The poison in our family tree had been rotting the roots for decades, and I was just the blind idiot who kept watering it. To truly understand how we ended up in that hotel lobby, you have to understand the massive, suffocating shadow I grew up in. That shadow had a name, Julian. Julian was the ultimate golden child, the perfect firstborn son who could do absolutely no wrong in the eyes of Arthur and Eleanor Bennett. If Julian got a solid C on a math test, my mother would march down to the school and argue that he was simply a misunderstood genius who did not test well. If I got a perfect A, my father would barely glance at the paper and tell me I was just lucky the test was easy. I spent my entire childhood wearing his faded, oversized hand-me-downs, riding his scratched and rusty bicycles, and quietly watching my parents pour every single ounce of their affection, energy, and financial resources into his future. The defining moment, the exact moment my soul cracked, came when I was 18 years old. It was 2 weeks before high school graduation. My parents sat me down at the kitchen table. The air was thick with a strange, awkward tension. My father cleared his throat, refusing to look me in the eye, and stared intently at his coffee mug. He told me that the college fund they had promised me since I was a little boy was completely gone. Every last penny. They had quietly drained my account to pay for Julian's exorbitant out-of-state tuition, his expensive fraternity fees, and a massive down payment on a brand new car because he supposedly needed to look professional for his prestigious summer internships. I remember sitting there, the cheap linoleum table feeling ice-cold under my trembling hands. I realized in that exact moment that my future, my dreams, and my education were entirely expendable if it meant making Julian's present just a little bit more comfortable. I was told very casually that I would simply have to take out student loans and figure it out myself. So I took out the loans. I worked brutal, exhausting night shifts at a shipping warehouse, hauling heavy boxes until my hands bled, just to pay for my classes during the day. I survived on cheap instant noodles, tap water, and maybe 4 hours of sleep a night. And when I finally graduated with honors, I did not get a lavish party or a proud family dinner. I got a brief, firm handshake from my father and a stern reminder to start paying off my debt immediately so it wouldn't affect the family's credit score. I funneled every single ounce of my pain, frustration, and anger into my work. I started a small logistics and supply chain company out of my cramped, roach-infested apartment. The first few years were absolute, unadulterated hell. My salary was practically non-existent. I ate, slept, and breathed the business. I sacrificed friendships, relationships, and my own health. And slowly, agonizingly, it began to grow. By the time I turned 30, My little LLC had exploded. I had 27 full-time employees, a sleek downtown office, and was generating serious, undeniable revenue. Suddenly, my family's selective amnesia miraculously cleared up. The quiet, burdensome son they had ignored for a decade was now a very convenient, highly liquid asset. Started small. A frantic phone call from my mother, her voice dripping with fake, maternal concern, mentioning that the roof was leaking terribly and they simply couldn't afford the repairs on fixed incomes. I wrote the check without a second thought. Then my father suddenly needed a new, top-of-the-line lawn tractor. I bought it. Felt incredibly good at first, I won't lie to you. It felt like I was finally, desperately earning my rightful place at the dinner table. But the requests rapidly escalated into demands. They stopped asking politely and started expecting it as their fundamental right. The most sickening part was how carefully they covered their tracks. They never, ever told anyone that I was the one footing the bills. When I bought them that beautiful multimillion-dollar beach condo as an early retirement gift, my father threw a massive, catered barbecue for the entire neighborhood. I stood in the corner, holding a cheap beer, while he gave a booming toast thanking Julian for his brilliant, unmatched real estate investments that made the purchase possible. Julian, who couldn't hold down a regular job for more than 6 months and was drowning in massive credit card debt, stood there, puffed out his chest, and soaked up the applause. I swallowed the bitter lump in my throat and told myself that as long as my parents were comfortable, it didn't matter who got the credit. But the financial drain soon became a gaping, bleeding wound. I started noticing massive, alarming discrepancies. I had specifically set up a special family emergency fund, a financial safety net meant exclusively for medical bills, because my father constantly complained about his failing joints and potential surgeries. One afternoon, while reviewing my accounts, I checked the trust statements. $34,000 had been withdrawn in a single massive lump sum. I completely panicked, thinking someone was dying in the hospital. I dropped everything and drove straight to their house, my heart in my throat. I did not find a sick, dying man. I found my father in the garage, aggressively polishing a pristine, fully restored vintage Porsche. He looked up at me, completely unashamed, and casually told me that a man of his stature needed a respectable hobby, and the luxury car was a perfectly reasonable reward for raising such responsible children. He had deliberately raided the medical fund to restore a sports car. I immediately confided in Marcus, my best friend and business partner. We were sitting in our office late one night, going over quarterly reports. Marcus looked at me, his face dead serious, and delivered a truth that felt like a punch to the gut. Liam, you are not a son to them. You are an open line of credit. If you don't cut the cord right now, they will bleed you completely dry and then complain that the blood wasn't warm enough. That very night, I created a highly secure folder on my encrypted hard drive. I named it Contingency. I started religiously keeping every single receipt, every signed contract, every bank transfer. Every time I paid for their expensive HOA fees, their property taxes, or Julian's sudden emergencies, the documentation went directly into that folder. I made absolutely sure my LLC was listed as the primary financial sponsor on every major asset. I wasn't actively planning a grand revenge. I was just terrified, building a desperate shield to protect myself. The final, fatal trigger was pulled just 3 weeks before the grand banquet. My phone buzzed loudly with a text from my mother. We need to talk about our 40th anniversary celebration. Come to the house immediately. It sounded innocent enough. But looking back now, it was the formal invitation to my own execution. I walked into my parents' stuffy, overly decorated living room that Sunday afternoon, completely unaware of the trap I was walking into. My mother, Eleanor, was sitting primly on the expensive velvet sofa next to Aunt Beatrice. Beatrice was my mother's older sister, a woman who specialized in weaponized guilt and psychological manipulation. She was the family's master puppeteer, always speaking in a soft, terribly concerned voice while expertly driving a knife straight into your back. "Liam, honey, come sit down," Beatrice cooed, patting the cushion next to her with a sickly sweet smile. Your parents are reaching a massive milestone. 40 incredible years of marriage. We want to throw them a truly grand celebration. A real high society event to show everyone how blessed this family is. I sat in the armchair opposite them, keeping a safe distance, feeling the familiar knot forming in my stomach. That sounds nice. How can I help with the planning? My mother let out a long, tragic, highly theatrical sigh. Well, Liam, you know how things are. Julian's massive fortune is temporarily tied up in his complex business ventures right now. And your father's pension barely covers our basic groceries. We were hoping you could just front the cost for the evening. Just as a short-term loan, of course, until Julian's investments pay off. A loan. The word was a hilarious, insulting joke, and we all knew it perfectly well. How much are we exactly talking about? I asked, bracing myself. Beatrice slid a heavy, glossy brochure across the mahogany coffee table. It was for the Grand Plaza Hotel, the single most expensive, exclusive venue in the entire state. It's a complete, all-inclusive package, she hummed, her eyes gleaming with greed. Gourmet, 5-star catering, a top-shelf open bar, a professional string quartet. It's exactly what your parents deserve, Liam, after everything they've sacrificed for you over the years. I stared down at the brochure. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask what exactly they had sacrificed for me, aside from stealing my college fund, ruining my credit at 18, and ignoring my entire existence unless my wallet was open. But the desperate, pathetic little boy inside me, the one who still foolishly craved their approval, took the wheel. I'll do it, I said quietly. But the contracts go strictly in my name under my company. That's the absolute only way my accountant will clear a corporate expense this massive. They agreed instantly, their faces lighting up with greedy joy. They did not care whose name was on the paper, as long as the cash flowed endlessly. The next 3 weeks were a living nightmare. The budget ballooned daily, spiraling completely out of control. My mother demanded a towering, imported champagne fountain. Julian requested boxes of premium, hand-rolled cigars for his upcoming wedding groomsmen, somehow magically tying it into the anniversary budget. Through it all, Beatrice was pulling the strings in the shadows, calling me late at night to say, "Don't upset your poor mother, Liam, just approve the extra charge for the caviar. You make so much money anyway. It's basically pennies to you." I signed every single contract. I paid every single bloated invoice. I honestly, stupidly thought I was buying a rare moment of genuine family unity and respect. The night of the rehearsal dinner, a small, exclusive gathering for VIP guests before the main event. I arrived at the hotel early to check on the floral arrangements. The heavy oak doors to the private lounge were slightly ajar. I was just about to walk in when I heard my father's booming, jovial voice carrying into the hallway. "Oh, it's nothing, really, just a small token," Arthur was saying, boasting loudly. He was holding court with several wealthy men from his country club. Julian's real estate firm had an absolutely fantastic quarter. He insisted on treating his mother and me. The boy is a financial genius, I tell you, an absolute titan of industry. One of the guests chuckled, swirling his whiskey. "That's wonderful, Arthur. And what about Liam, the quiet one? Still doing that little delivery thing?" My father let out a harsh, incredibly dismissive laugh that echoed in the room. "Liam? Oh, he has his cute little side gig. Moves boxes around or something, barely scrapes by. He means well, but he doesn't have a shred of Julian's business acumen. Never did. Honestly, gentlemen, we just invite him to these things so he doesn't feel left out. He's always been so needy and sensitive." My blood turned to absolute ice. A cute little side gig. Needy. I was the sole person keeping a solid roof over their heads, the one paying for the very whiskey he was arrogantly sipping, the one who had bought the suit on his back, and he was using me as a pathetic punchline to elevate his golden child. I pushed the heavy doors open. The thick would hit the wall with a loud, resounding thud. The entire room fell instantly silent. My father turned around, his face dropping in horror for a fraction of a second before the arrogant, dismissive mask aggressively snapped back into place. "Ah, Liam," he said smoothly, trying to recover. "Glad you could finally make it. Go grab a drink from the back." "I think I've bought enough drinks for this entire room," I said, my voice dangerously, terrifyingly calm. I looked directly at Julian, who was standing by the bar, suddenly looking very interested in his expensive leather shoes. "Julian's real estate firm? That's hilarious. I didn't know maxing out your wife's credit cards to pay for your gambling debts counted as a firm." Julian flushed a dark, angry red. "Shut your mouth, Liam. Liam, do not dare cause a scene in front of our important guests." My mother hissed venomously, rushing forward and grabbing my arm. "A scene?" I asked, stepping further into the center of the room, shaking her hand off me. "I'm not causing a scene. I'm just clarifying the official financial records. Since Dad here seems to be severely confused about whose bank account is actually keeping this entire family from living in a cardboard box." My father's face contorted with pure, unadulterated rage. His supreme authority was being openly challenged in public, his absolute worst nightmare. He slammed his crystal glass down on the table so hard it cracked, the amber liquid splashing everywhere. He marched right up to me, his chest puffed out aggressively, trying to physically intimidate me like he did when I was a child. "You ungrateful, disgusting little brat," he spat, his voice dropping to a vicious, hateful whisper. "You think having a few extra dollars gives you the right to embarrass me in my own venue? You are nothing. You have always been nothing. Everything you have is because of the superior work ethic I instilled in you." I stared dead into his eyes, seeing the absolute lack of love, the pure, unadulterated contempt that had always been there. "You instilled nothing in me but trauma and crushing debt," I said evenly. That was when he completely lost his mind. He turned to the crowd, raising his voice so every single person in the venue could hear. The music seemed to fade away completely. "Get this beggar out," he roared, pointing a trembling, furious finger at the door. "Get him out of my sight right now." And that brings us back to the moment the security guard grabbed my arm, the moment I walked out, and the moment I unleashed the ultimate financial apocalypse from the dark, quiet front seat of my car. The drive home from the hotel was an absolute blur of passing streetlights and glowing highway signs. My phone buzzed relentlessly, aggressively vibrating in the passenger seat, lighting up the dark cabin with an endless stream of notifications. Incoming calls from Julian. Frantic, missed calls from my mother. Furious, angry texts from numbers I didn't even recognize. The venom was spreading through the family network like wildfire, but I didn't answer a single one. I pulled into the wide driveway of my quiet, sprawling suburban home, the gravel crunching satisfyingly under my tires. The silence of my empty house was usually deeply comforting, but tonight, the air felt thick and heavily charged, like the eerie moment right before a massive lightning strike. I had barely stepped inside, taken off my suit jacket, and poured myself a tall glass of ice water when the violent pounding started. It wasn't a polite, hesitant knock. It was the frantic, aggressive hammering of someone actively trying to break the door off its hinges. I walked slowly into the hallway, my footsteps completely silent on the expensive hardwood floor, and peered through the security peephole. It was Chloe, Julian's demanding, high-maintenance wife. Her expensive designer dress was heavily wrinkled. Her carefully applied makeup was completely smudged with tears, and her face was a terrifying mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. Julian stood just behind her, pacing furiously back and forth on my front porch, screaming into his cell phone. "Liam, open this damn door right now." Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs, slamming her fists violently against the thick oak wood. "I know you're in there. Your car is in the driveway. Open up." I did not open the door. I simply leaned close to the wood and spoke in a clear, carrying, utterly emotionless voice. "It's extremely late, Chloe. If you continue to damage my property, I will not hesitate to call the police." She gasped loudly, visibly startled by hearing my voice so close to her. "You need to fix this right now, Liam," she shrieked hysterically through the door. We were literally checking in online for our flight to the Maldives, and the airline agent said the tickets were voided. The luxury hotel won't release our honeymoon suite. The booking system says the corporate card flagged the entire transaction as fraud. Fix it. Put the money back. I leaned my forehead against the cool, solid wood, feeling an immense wave of calm wash over me. There is absolutely nothing to fix, Chloe. The payments were categorized as an unauthorized use of corporate company funds. I simply corrected the accounting error. Have a good night. You did this because your dad yelled at you? Julian's voice chimed in, muffled through the door but still dripping with his usual, sickening condescension. He stepped right up to the door, pounding once. Come on, Liam. Don't be so incredibly dramatic. You're throwing a childish tantrum and ruining our honeymoon. Be a man, open your app, and turn the credit card back on. I felt a cold, sharp smile slowly touch my lips in the dark hallway. Julian, you are 37 years old. You claim to be a real estate titan. Be a man and pay for your own damn vacation. They're your parents. They're your family, Chloe yelled, her voice completely cracking with desperation. They called me a beggar, I replied, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or empathy. So I finally stopped giving them handouts. Good night to you both. I turned my back and walked away from the door, completely ignoring the fresh, violent wave of pounding and screaming that erupted behind me. I walked straight into my home office, powered on my massive desktop monitors, and opened the heavily encrypted contingency folder. I sat there in the cool, blue glow of the screens, surrounded by 3 solid years of meticulous, undeniably legally binding records. The storm was violently raging outside my house, but in here, right in the eye of the hurricane, I was perfectly, peacefully calm. I did not sleep for a single second that night. I organized digital files, drafted formal emails, and prepared my absolute best weapons for the massive legal war that would inevitably start the second the sun came up. At exactly 7 a.m., my computer pinged with an urgent, high-priority email. It was from Franklin, an elderly, incredibly meticulous man who had been my parents' certified public accountant for decades. I had given him my direct contact information years ago when I first started handling their property taxes for them. The subject line read, Urgent. Severe discrepancies in Bennett Trust and property tax filings. I immediately picked up my phone and dialed his direct number. Franklin answered on the very first ring, sounding incredibly stressed and out of breath. Liam, thank goodness you called, he breathed heavily. I've been going over your parents' annual financial filings all night, trying to process the sudden, massive bounce-backs on the condo mortgage payments. I desperately need you to clarify something for me right now. The payments for the beach property haven't been coming from the family trust account like they claimed. I know, I said calmly. They've been coming directly from my corporate LLC. I have been solely funding that property for 3 years. There was a heavy, terrifying, dead silence on the other end of the line. Liam, Franklin finally said, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. Your parents have been officially declaring that million-dollar condo as an inheritance gift from a private, unnamed family investor. They have been using that specific legal classification to completely shield the property from massive federal tax liabilities. They never once disclosed to the IRS that a corporate entity was paying the mortgage. I gripped the phone tightly, the expensive leather of my desk chair creaking loudly as I leaned forward. Franklin, are you telling me they committed federal tax fraud? If they knowingly and deliberately hid the corporate origin of the funds to avoid paying taxes? Yes, absolutely. And Liam, it gets worse. The property title is still technically tethered to your LLC's financial guarantees. By illegally hiding this, they have heavily exposed your entire company to a massive federal audit. Have you signed any sworn declarations for them regarding this property? None. Not a single piece of paper, I said. My mind was racing, furiously connecting the dots. They hadn't just been ungrateful, greedy leeches. They had been actively using my extreme generosity to build illegal equity, completely willing to risk my entire business, my livelihood, and my freedom in the process just to maintain their fake illusion of extreme wealth. Franklin, I said, my voice hardening into steel, send me every single document, every form, every email they filed regarding that condo. Immediately. As soon as I hung up the phone, I made the one call I had been quietly avoiding for years. I called Tiffany. Tiffany was my lead corporate attorney. She was a ruthless shark in a tailored Chanel suit, a brilliant woman who operated strictly on cold logic and took absolutely zero prisoners in the courtroom. I walked into her sleek, downtown high-rise office exactly 2 hours later, dropping a massive, heavy stack of meticulously tabbed folders onto her polished glass desk. She opened the files and flipped slowly through the first few pages, her perfectly manicured fingernails tracing the highlighted financial transfers, the forged signatures, the unpaid invoices. She slowly looked up at me, her eyes incredibly sharp and highly assessing. They really called you a beggar in front of 50 people while standing in a high-end luxury room that you entirely paid for? She asked, a slight, incredibly dangerous smile forming on her lips. Yes, they did, I said. Tiffany forcefully closed the folder and formally folded her hands on top of it. This isn't just about hurt feelings or family drama anymore, Liam. This is massive financial fraud, gross misrepresentation, unauthorized use of corporate funds. We can legally freeze every single asset connected to your name. We can legally and aggressively rip that beach condo right out from under them before they even know what hit them. She paused, studying my face carefully. But you need to be ready, Liam. They will try to call your bluff. They will cry. They will threaten to disown you. They will tell everyone you are destroying the family over money. I turned and looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of her office, looking far down at the busy city traffic moving below. The desperate little boy who just wanted his parents' love was completely, permanently dead. They already called my bluff last night, I said softly, turning back to face her. Draft the papers, Tiffany. All of them. The brutal lawsuit, the immediate cease and desist, the full property reassignment. It is finally time to show them exactly what a beggar can do when he decides to buy the whole damn bank. The tension in the days immediately following my explosive meeting with Tiffany was absolutely suffocating. It felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded, waiting for the inevitable detonation. I spent that entire weekend completely off the grid. I stayed locked inside my quiet suburban house, ignoring the hundreds of frantic text messages and missed calls that were aggressively blowing up my phone every 5 minutes. The sheer volume of the panic was staggering. My cousin Sarah, a woman I had always considered to be somewhat of a neutral party in our toxic family dynamics, had sent me a massive, overly emotional text message at 2 in the morning. She begged me to just apologize to my father and immediately release the frozen funds for the sake of family peace. She claimed that my father's blood pressure was dangerously high, that my mother hadn't stopped crying for 3 days, and that Julian's wife, Chloe, was threatening a massive divorce. But thanks to Tiffany's highly efficient private investigator, who had been pulling digital records, I already knew the ugly truth about Sarah. Sarah was the exact person who had secretly forwarded copies of my business success, my salary estimates, and my real estate holdings to my parents years ago. She had been acting as their little financial spy, feeding their greed while pretending to be my confidant. There was absolutely no loyalty in this family. There was only a ruthless, shifting alliance of convenience. By Tuesday morning, I was finally back in my downtown office, desperately trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The logistics company I had painstakingly built from the ground up, sacrificing my entire 20s in the process, was buzzing with its usual high-stakes energy. Phones were ringing off the hook. My 27 employees were aggressively negotiating interstate freight contracts. And for a few precious hours, I felt normal. I felt like the highly successful CEO I actually was, instead of the pathetic, needy disappointment my family so desperately wanted me to be. I was sitting at the massive, custom-built oak conference table with my business partner, Marcus. We were deeply engrossed in going over our quarterly salary projections and analyzing a massive commercial real estate acquisition for a new distribution warehouse. The bright morning sun was pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished wood of the table. We were right in the middle of discussing the tax implications of the new property when the heavy glass doors of our executive suite violently swung open. I didn't even have to look up from my spreadsheets to know exactly who it was. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance of the heavy footsteps echoing across the reception area gave them away instantly. It was the walk of men who genuinely believed they owned the ground they walked on. "Excuse me, gentlemen, you absolutely cannot go back there without a scheduled appointment." My receptionist, Elena, a sharp and fiercely protective woman, said firmly, her chair rolling back as she stood up to block them. "I don't need a damn appointment to see my own son." A booming, aggressively familiar voice shot back, dripping with absolute contempt. "Back off, sweetheart, before I have him fire you. We have private, highly sensitive family business to discuss." Marcus immediately stopped talking. He slowly closed his laptop, the soft click echoing in the quiet room. He looked across the table at me, his jaw tightening into a hard line. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He had warned me about this exact scenario for years. The heavy oak door to the conference room was aggressively pushed open, hitting the rubber wall stopper with a loud, violent thud that shook the glass panes. My father, Arthur, strode into the room, wearing a perfectly tailored golf shirt and an expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement. Right behind him was Julian, my golden child older brother, looking severely sleep-deprived, highly agitated, and furiously angry. They had walked right into the massive, fatal trap of their own staggering complacency. They honestly, truly thought they could just march into my place of business, throw their imaginary weight around, threaten my staff, embarrass me in front of my employees, and I would instantly fold like a cheap lawn chair, just like I always did when I was a terrified teenager. They thought the old, toxic dynamic of abuse and submission was still perfectly intact. I remained seated. I did not stand up to greet them. I did not offer them coffee. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, slowly folded my hands together on the desk, and stared at them with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a frozen lake. To what exactly do I owe the absolute displeasure of this unannounced visit? I asked, my voice completely flat, dead, and entirely devoid of any recognizable emotion. My father stopped right at the edge of the conference table, placing both of his heavy hands firmly on the polished wood and actively leaning over, attempting to physically dominate my space. It was the exact same cheap psychological intimidation tactic he had used when I was 12 years old and had accidentally broken a garage window. But I wasn't a scared 12-year-old boy anymore. I was a 35-year-old man who held the absolute legal and financial power to destroy him. "You are going to fix this, Liam. Right now," my father demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl that was clearly meant to sound incredibly threatening. "I don't know what kind of childish, dramatic, pathetic tantrum you think you are currently throwing, but it ends today. Right this second. The hotel manager is threatening a massive, public lawsuit over the unpaid banquet invoices. Julian's luxury travel agent is demanding immediate cash payment for the honeymoon flights, or they are canceling the entire itinerary. You have humiliated this proud family for the absolute last time." Julian stepped out from behind our father, his face flushed an ugly, dark, mottled red. "Do you have any earthly idea what you have done?" Julian spat, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at my face. "Chloe has been hysterically crying in our bedroom for 3 straight days. We had to cancel our entire non-refundable itinerary. My wealthy father-in-law is suddenly asking incredibly invasive questions about my personal finances and my salary. You made me look like an absolute broke fool, Liam. Pull out your phone. Turn the damn corporate credit card back on right now. Pay the exorbitant late fees you caused, and maybe, just maybe, we will find it in our hearts to forgive you for this stunt." I looked at Julian. I really, truly looked at him. I looked at the deep, dark circles under his bloodshot eyes, the slight, nervous tremble in his hands. The cheap, knockoff designer watch he had bought to desperately impress people he actively despised. I felt absolutely nothing for him. No brotherly love. No deep-seated pity. No familial loyalty. Nothing but a cold, clinical observation of a deeply pathetic man. "Forgive me," I asked quietly, letting the absurd words hang heavily in the tense air of the conference room. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly. You violently break into my private office, aggressively interrupt my workday, threaten my receptionist, and generously offer to forgive me for no longer funding your pathetic, entirely fake lifestyle. Watch your damn mouth when you speak to your older brother." My father snapped furiously, slamming his open palm violently against the table. The loud, sharp crack echoed off the glass walls. Several of my employees outside in the bullpen nervously glanced toward the conference room, clearly alarmed. Julian is a highly respected, successful professional. He doesn't deserve this kind of blatant, disgusting disrespect from someone like you. You are acting completely unhinged over one tiny, insignificant little argument at a party. A tiny little argument, I repeated softly, the sheer, staggering audacity of his delusional words actually making me laugh. It was a cold, harsh, hollow sound that seemed to unnerve them both. "You stood in front of 50 wealthy people, drinking vintage champagne that I fully paid for, standing in a luxury room that I legally rented, and screamed at a security guard to throw the beggar out. You publicly, viciously humiliated your own son just to protect your incredibly fragile, pathetic ego." "I was actively protecting the family image," my father roared back, completely losing his temper, his face turning purple. "You were acting entirely out of line. You were deeply jealous of Julian's massive success, just like you have always been since you were a child. You were deliberately trying to ruin a beautiful, expensive evening with your petty, pathetic insecurities, and I quickly put a stop to it. That is exactly what a strong patriarch does. I maintain the order in this family." He actually believed it. He believed his own sick, delusional narrative. He had lied to himself for so many decades that he genuinely thought he was the innocent victim of my supposed jealousy. He genuinely, truly believed that the money I bled for, the salary I earned, and the real estate I owned was simply his rightful property, a natural expected tax I owed him for the glorious unearned privilege of sharing his last name. Marcus quietly and calmly stood up from his leather chair. "Liam, do you want me to call building security and have these two removed for trespassing?" he asked, his voice incredibly steady and completely professional, completely unbothered by my father's screaming. "No, Marcus, thank you," I said, my eyes never leaving my father's furious face. "Let them stay. I want them to hear every single word of this." My father scoffed loudly, arrogantly crossing his arms over his chest. "Yes, Marcus, let the boy speak. Let's hear what kind of brilliant, foolproof legal defense my son thinks he has for actively abandoning his family and deliberately breaking binding verbal contracts." Julian sneered, suddenly gaining a wave of false, arrogant confidence from our father's loud bluster. "You honestly think having a little bit of money makes you invincible, Liam? You're playing a very, very stupid game with the wrong people. My father's lawyer, Sterling, has already drafted a massive lawsuit for severe breach of contract, financial abandonment, and severe emotional distress. If you don't release those funds by noon today, we are taking you straight to civil court. We will drain this pathetic little logistics company completely dry and take every dime you have." The massive trap of their boundless arrogance was now fully sprung. They were standing right in the middle of my territory, aggressively threatening me with massive legal action over money they had systematically stolen from me. It was so incredibly poetic, so perfectly symmetrical, that I almost smiled. I slowly rolled my chair forward, sitting up perfectly straight. I reached under the heavy conference table and unlocked the secure bottom drawer of my desk. I reached inside and pulled out a massive, thick, heavily bound black folder. Tiffany had couriered it over to me via secure messenger just an hour ago. The shiny gold lettering on the front cover simply read, "The Bennett File." "A lawsuit," I said, placing the heavy, intimidating folder firmly on the absolute center of the table with a loud thud. That is a truly fascinating legal strategy, Julian. Really. Takes a lot of nerve. But before you and your highly expensive, aggressive lawyer file a single piece of paper with the courts, I highly suggest you open that folder. Because the very moment you take me to court, every single classified document inside that binder becomes a public, legally binding, easily searchable record. My father stared down at the black folder as if it were a highly venomous snake ready to strike. His loud bravado wavered for just a fraction of a second, revealing a tiny, panicked crack in his thick armor. "I'm not playing your stupid, dramatic little mind games, Liam," my father said, stubbornly refusing to touch the binder. "Just be a man and write the damn check. Open the folder, Arthur," I commanded, my voice dropping the title of Dad forever. The sudden shift in my tone was so abrupt, so utterly dominant and cold, that both he and Julian physically flinched backward. Hesitantly, with a visibly trembling hand, Julian reached out and slowly flipped the heavy black cover open. The very first page was a simple, legally certified document. And that was the exact, beautiful moment the oxygen completely left the room and the financial execution finally began. I thought the worst was over. I was so incredibly wrong. Julian's eyes darted frantically across the first document, absorbing the dense legal jargon. It was a certified, notarized deed from the county clerk's office. I sat in absolute silence and watched the color completely drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence. "What is it? What does it say?" my father demanded, rapidly losing his temper and his patience. He aggressively snatched the heavy stack of papers right out of Julian's shaking hands, quickly pulling his expensive reading glasses from his shirt pocket and shoving them onto his face. I leaned forward, slowly steepling my fingers together on the desk. "That, Arthur, is the official, legally binding property deed to the luxury beach condo. The exact same condo you proudly tell all your wealthy country club friends is an inheritance from a mysterious, rich uncle. The one you aggressively brag about owning free and clear. Read the name of the corporate holding company listed as the absolute sole owner and primary financial guarantor at the bottom of the page." My father's eyes frantically scanned the document, his breath catching in his throat. His lips moved silently as he read the bold, undeniable print. "Parker Logistics, LLC. My company. My money. You put this entire property in your company's name?" my father stammered, his booming voice suddenly lacking all of its previous thunder and authority. He looked up at me, genuine confusion and rising panic in his eyes. "We had an agreement, Liam. You promised this was a gift to us. A lavish retirement gift for your mother and me to enjoy our golden years. A legal gift requires a formal transfer of title," I explained, my voice as cold, precise, and unfeeling as a surgeon's scalpel cutting through flesh. "I never transferred the title because you explicitly, directly asked me not to. You told me you wanted to avoid the massive property tax spikes and the HOA assessments, so you asked me to just keep paying the heavy mortgage quietly behind the scenes. But my accountant, Franklin, found a very, very interesting discrepancy when he was reviewing your recent tax returns." I reached across the table and ruthlessly flipped to the next neatly organized tab in the folder. A stark copy of their federal tax filing, aggressively highlighted in bright, glaring yellow ink. "You formally declared the property to the IRS as a fully paid-off inheritance asset to drastically lower your income bracket and avoid capital gains," I continued, watching my father begin to physically shake as the reality of his crimes set in. "You knowingly, deliberately committed federal tax fraud. You actively hid the absolute fact that a corporate entity was paying your mortgage, which legally exposes my business to a massive, devastating IRS audit. You used my hard-earned money, my extreme generosity, to intentionally build a highly fraudulent financial profile. We didn't know," my father practically shouted, absolute, raw panic finally replacing his arrogant anger. It was a massive mistake by the accountant. Franklin must have misfiled the paperwork. We trusted him to handle the inheritance forms properly. Do not dare blame Franklin, I shot back, my voice echoing loudly off the glass walls, shutting down his pathetic lie instantly. He has the exact, time-stamped emails you sent him, explicitly instructing him to categorize the condo as a private family inheritance. It was a calculated, deliberate, premeditated lie to cheat the government while living on my dime. I didn't stop there. Couldn't stop. 35 years of rage was pouring out of me in the form of undeniable legal documents. I forcefully flipped to the third, thickest tab in the heavy folder. This was the one that was going to completely, permanently destroy the Golden Child myth forever. Now, let's talk about the Family Trust Fund, I said, turning my cold gaze directly onto Julian. The emergency medical fund that I personally established and funded 5 years ago to ensure my parents were taken care of in their old age. The exact fund that I was told was completely drained due to incredibly expensive, out-of-pocket spinal medical treatments for Dad. Julian physically took a huge step back away from the table, his eyes wide with absolute, genuine terror. "Liam, please don't," he whispered, his voice cracking. All his previous arrogance completely vanishing into thin air. I completely ignored his pathetic plea. I reached into the folder and pulled out a towering, intimidating stack of bank transfer receipts, wire logs, and offshore credit card statements that Tiffany's ruthless forensic accountant had meticulously dug up. I threw them aggressively across the table. They fanned out like a deadly deck of playing cards, officially exposing every single ugly, dirty secret they had desperately tried to bury. $34,000, I stated loudly, forcefully tapping a specific, highlighted bank transfer with my index finger, categorized specifically as spinal surgery copays. But the routing number didn't go to a hospital. It didn't go to a physical therapist. It went directly to a high-end, exclusive vintage auto restoration shop. To completely rebuild your prized Porsche, Arthur. My father opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of pathetic excuse, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked exactly like a fish suffocating on dry land, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. "And here," I said, pulling out a massive secondary stack of statements, slamming them down directly in front of Julian so hard the table shook. Over $60,000 systematically and quietly siphoned out of the emergency medical trust over 2 years. Categorized in the ledger as home repairs and elder living assistance. But the money went directly to pay off Julian's massive, crippling gambling debts at 3 different offshore online casinos, and to completely cover the massive financial shortfall in his failing real estate firm so his wealthy wife wouldn't find out he was totally, utterly bankrupt. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far, you're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Now, back to the total destruction of the Bennett family illusion. Julian's knees actually buckled under the weight of the undeniable truth. He desperately grabbed the high back of a leather conference chair just to keep from physically collapsing onto the floor. He looked terrifiedly at our father, absolutely dreading the reaction. But Arthur wasn't looking at Julian. He was staring blindly at the undeniable, legally certified proof of his own massive theft. The Porsche, the federal tax fraud, the endless, suffocating lies. Everything he had built his entire arrogant, patriarchal identity upon was resting entirely on a foundation of severe financial crimes against his own son. "You illegally hacked my private accounts," Julian weakly accused, though he sounded exactly like a terrified little boy on the verge of tears. "I didn't have to hack a single thing, Julian," I said coldly, relishing the look of absolute defeat on his face. "I am the primary source of the corporate funds. I have the absolute legal right to formally request a full forensic audit of all destination accounts when severe corporate fraud is suspected. My lawyer, Tiffany, has already forwarded this entire, comprehensive folder to the county prosecutor's office as a preliminary filing. You went to a lawyer? My father gasped, desperately clutching his chest as if he were having a heart attack. He was finally truly realizing the catastrophic, life-altering scale of the disaster he had aggressively caused. Liam, you can't possibly do this. We are your family. We share the same blood. If this gets out, if the country club finds out about the condo, my reputation will be completely, permanently ruined. The IRS will seize everything we own. Your reputation, I repeated, the absolute, bitter disgust dripping heavily from every single syllable. That is the only thing you have ever cared about. Not the devastating fact that you stole from me. Not the fact that you lied to my face for years. Not the fact that you cruelly called me a beggar in public. You are only terrified that the wealthy neighbors will finally see that the emperor has absolutely no clothes and no money. I stood up, towering over the table, assuming total control of the room. Here is exactly what is going to happen next. I am formally filing a massive civil lawsuit against both of you for severe financial restitution and corporate fraud. I am legally, officially evicting you from the beach condo by the end of this month. The formal, notarized notices are being physically posted on the door by a process server today, and I am permanently freezing every single dime of financial support. You are completely, utterly, and permanently cut off. You can't just leave us with absolutely nothing, my father yelled, hot tears of sheer panic finally forming in his eyes, his voice breaking. We will lose the house. We will be entirely destitute. Julian has a baby on the way. For God's sake. I looked at them, the supposed golden child, completely exposed as a pathetic gambling addict. The proud, arrogant patriarch, revealed as nothing more than a fraudulent thief. I am not leaving you with nothing, I said, my voice eerily, terrifyingly calm as I walked toward the door to open it for them. I am simply leaving you with exactly what you have earned on your own merit. And from what I can clearly see on these legal papers, that is absolutely nothing. I opened the heavy glass door wide. Get out of my office. The absolute next time we speak, it will be in a courtroom under oath with a court reporter. And if you ever try to contact my business again, I will have you aggressively arrested for trespassing. They didn't argue. They didn't threaten me anymore. They walked slowly out of my office in absolute, humiliating, crushing silence. Their heads bowed low, the heavy black folder of damning evidence left sitting on the table like a loaded gun. The long, agonizing weeks leading up to the official court date were shockingly, beautifully quiet. The constant, suffocating barrage of manipulative text messages from my mother completely stopped. The aggressive, desperate threats from Julian ceased to exist entirely. They had finally, brutally realized that they had absolutely no leverage left. Their entire, meticulously crafted house of cards had completely collapsed, and they were desperately trying to scramble through the financial wreckage to save themselves from total ruin. In a last-ditch effort, they hired Sterling, an incredibly expensive, highly aggressive defense attorney who specialized specifically in wealthy family disputes, complex trust funds, and quiet, high-stakes divorce settlements. Sterling tried absolutely everything in his vast legal power to make this massive problem go away without a highly publicized, embarrassing public trial. He sent Tiffany a formal, incredibly insulting settlement offer just 3 days before the preliminary hearing. They offered to pay back $50,000 over an agonizingly slow period of 10 years, promising to sign a strict, ironclad non-disclosure agreement to keep the entire embarrassing ordeal completely out of the public eye. Tiffany called me into her sleek office to review the pathetic offer. She tossed the thick legal document onto her desk with a loud scoff of pure disgust. They are desperately trying to quietly patch the massive holes in the sinking ship before the neighbors see them drowning, she said, sharply tapping her expensive pen against the glass desk. 50 grand over 10 years is an absolute, undeniable insult to our intelligence. It barely covers the illegal tax liability they recklessly exposed you to, let alone the stolen trust funds. I didn't even need to think about it for a single second. Rejected immediately, I said firmly, my voice unwavering. I don't want a quiet, swept-under-the-rug settlement. I honestly don't care about recovering the money anymore. I want a permanent, legally binding, highly visible public record. I want a judge to look them directly in the eye and force them to legally admit exactly what they did to me. When the highly anticipated court date finally arrived, the weather was brutally cold, gray, and raining heavily, perfectly matching the grim, serious reality of the situation. I walked proudly into the sterile, brightly lit courtroom wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored charcoal suit, feeling a strange, profound sense of deep inner peace. For my entire life, I had walked on eggshells around my family, terrified of their harsh judgment and desperate for their approval. Today, I was the sole person bringing the hammer of judgment down on them. My parents sat nervously across the center aisle at the defendant's table. They looked absolutely horrific. My mother had visibly aged 10 years. She was obsessively clutching a crumpled tissue, her eyes red, swollen, and darting around the room in sheer panic. My father sat stiffly in his chair, his face pale and deeply drawn, entirely stripped of his usual booming arrogance and fake country club charm. Julian sat behind them in the gallery, staring blankly at his lap, looking exactly like a thoroughly beaten, exhausted dog. Judge Harper, a brilliant, no-nonsense woman with sharp, observing eyes and an incredibly low tolerance for legal nonsense, took the bench. From the very first minute she opened the file, it was a complete and utter legal bloodbath. Sterling, their high-priced, arrogant lawyer, stood up and desperately tried to spin a pathetic, emotional narrative about complicated, informal family dynamics. He loudly argued that the massive funds were freely given gifts out of love, that the massive trust fund withdrawals were simple misunderstandings between a loving father and a generous son, and that I was simply a disgruntled, overly sensitive child acting out aggressively over a minor social slight at an anniversary party. Judge Harper wasn't buying a single solitary word of his expensive fiction. "Mr. Sterling," the judge interrupted aggressively, her loud voice cutting through his dramatic, well-rehearsed speech like a serrated knife. "Are you seriously standing in my courtroom, attempting to classify the deliberate redirection of $60,000 into offshore online gambling accounts as a simple family misunderstanding?" Sterling stammered nervously, physically pulling at his tight collar, realizing he was losing control of the room. "Your Honor, the family trust was highly informal in nature. It is absolutely not informal when it involves falsified federal tax documents and the unauthorized use of corporate LLC shields." Judge Harper snapped loudly, violently slamming her hand on the heavy oak desk. She turned her sharp, furious gaze directly onto my father. Arthur visibly shrank down into his heavy wooden chair, looking tiny and incredibly fragile. "Mr. Bennett, you deliberately signed federal tax returns declaring a luxury property as an inheritance to blatantly avoid taxes, while simultaneously and maliciously draining a medical emergency fund to restore a vintage sports car. You used your son's corporate entity as your own personal, illegal slush fund." My father desperately tried to speak, trying to summon that old, fake patriarchal charm to manipulate the room. "Your Honor, please, if I may explain, Liam has always been very generous, but he can be quite emotional and unstable. We are a good, upstanding family. We just made some unfortunate administrative errors regarding the paperwork. Administrative errors do not systematically pay off massive casino debts, Mr. Bennett," the judge replied coldly, completely shutting him down. She turned her attention entirely to me. "Mr. Parker, what exactly is the outcome you are formally seeking today? Are you pushing the state for criminal fraud charges and potential jail time?" I stood up slowly, calmly buttoning my suit jacket. The entire courtroom was dead, suffocatingly silent. I looked at my mother, who was silently weeping, her makeup running down her face. I looked at my father, who was staring at me with a pathetic, desperate, begging plea in his bloodshot eyes. "No, Your Honor," I said, my voice calm, perfectly steady, and echoing in the large room. "I do not want them in jail. That is a heavy burden of guilt I do not wish to carry. I simply want the undeniable truth permanently recorded on paper. I want the total restitution of the misused funds returned immediately to my corporate accounts, and I want the legal title of the beach condo permanently and irrevocably transferred solely into my name, completely severing any and all of their access to it. Let the legal record finally match reality. Judge Harper nodded approvingly, looking at me with a deep sense of respect. Granted in full, she declared, her heavy wooden gavel coming down with a loud, incredibly final crack. With that single, decisive strike, it was officially over. The court formally ordered the immediate, forced transfer of the property title and mandated a strict, unyielding repayment schedule for the stolen funds, heavily garnished directly from my father's actual, meager pension and Julian's remaining salary. They were legally barred from ever accessing my financial resources, my credit, or my company again. As the large courtroom slowly cleared out, they didn't even try to speak to me. There were absolutely no fake apologies. There were no manipulative tears of reconciliation. There was only the suffocating, incredibly heavy silence of a massive, lifelong illusion completely shattering into a million pieces. They walked slowly out of the heavy wooden doors, utterly defeated and broken, and I stood there in the aisle, breathing freely and deeply for the absolute first time in 35 years. Several long, incredibly peaceful months passed in absolute, glorious silence. My cell phone did not ring at 3 a.m. with fake, manufactured financial emergencies. My corporate bank accounts were no longer randomly and aggressively drained to secretly fund luxury vacations, high-end shopping sprees, or illegal gambling debts. My logistics business, finally completely freed from the massive, suffocating financial anchor of my family's endless greed, experienced its absolute most profitable quarter in company history. I successfully listed and sold the luxury beach condo to a wealthy, retired couple from New York. The exact day the massive multimillion-dollar wire transfer successfully hit my bank account, officially clearing the sale, I finally felt the absolute last heavy, rusted chain drop from my tired shoulders. But old, deeply ingrained habits of toxicity die extremely hard in desperate, narcissistic families. One rainy Tuesday evening, I came home from a long day at the office to find a plain, unmarked white envelope slid halfway underneath my front door. It had no stamp, no return address, and no name. Just a heavy, thick envelope sitting silently on my expensive hardwood floor. I picked it up cautiously and carried it into the brightly lit kitchen. I opened it carefully, half expecting some kind of desperate legal summons or a new, frivolous lawsuit from Sterling. Inside was a single, high-quality, glossy 8x10 photograph from the grand anniversary banquet. It was a candid, high-resolution shot taken by one of the extremely expensive professional photographers I had personally hired and paid for. The photo perfectly showed the lavish, expensive ballroom, the glowing crystal chandeliers, and the dozens of wealthy guests dressed in their expensive silver and navy gowns, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding. And in the background, slightly blurry but completely, undeniably unmistakable, was me. The photographer had accidentally captured the exact, humiliating moment the hotel security guard grabbed my arm, the exact moment I turned my back on my parents and began walking toward the heavy exit doors. On the back of the photograph, written in Julian's highly recognizable, sloppy, aggressive handwriting, was a single venomous sentence. This was the exact moment it all fell apart for us, Liam. It was a final, incredibly pathetic attempt at emotional manipulation. A desperate, heavy-handed guilt trip meant to somehow make me deeply regret walking away from the abuse. They wanted me to look at that photo and feel personally responsible for the total, catastrophic collapse of their high society illusion and their financial ruin. I stood alone in my quiet kitchen, staring blankly at the sloppy handwriting. I didn't feel a single ounce of burning anger. I didn't feel a shred of deep sadness or regret. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound sense of deep pity for deeply broken people who valued a fake, expensive public image over the love and loyalty of their own flesh and blood. I walked calmly into my home office, turned on my heavy-duty, cross-cut paper shredder, and slowly fed the glossy photograph directly into the spinning metal blades. The loud, aggressive grinding noise of the machine violently destroying the image was incredibly, deeply satisfying. Because Julian was completely, entirely wrong. What fell apart that fateful night wasn't our family. What fell apart was the sickening, highly orchestrated illusion of a family. A fake, hollow illusion they had desperately built using my money, my enforced silence, and my pathetic childhood need to desperately belong to something. And once that toxic, suffocating illusion finally burned away to nothing but ash, what remained wasn't a sad tragedy. It was absolute, unadulterated freedom. The very next morning, I took a massive, significant portion of the money from the condo sale and officially walked into a major bank to establish an entirely new corporate entity. I proudly named it the Bennett Foundation. It was a specialized, heavily funded philanthropic grant program specifically designed to provide massive, life-changing financial support to young, ambitious first-generation men and women who were aggressively putting themselves through college and starting small businesses completely without the financial or emotional support of their families. I took the deep, lingering pain of my stolen college fund, the terrible agony of my lonely, debt-ridden 20s, and the ultimate betrayal of my own blood, and I intentionally turned it into a massive, powerful lifeline for people who actually deserved it. I became the exact financial sponsor, the exact mentor, that I had so desperately needed when I was a terrified 18-year-old kid eating cheap noodles and working brutal night shifts in a freezing warehouse. It has been over 2 full years now since that day in court, and I have had absolutely zero direct contact with my parents, with Julian, or with anyone else in that toxic, draining orbit. Our relationship is permanently severed by a mutual, legally enforced, unspoken agreement of total silence. I hear quiet rumors through the family grapevine sometimes. I know my parents had to drastically downsize from their massive house to a small, cramped 2-bedroom apartment. I know Julian is deeply struggling to find a job that will tolerate his massive ego and his ruined credit score. But their daily struggles, their unpaid bills, and their misery are no longer my heavy burden to carry. Sometimes, the absolute healthiest, most loving, and most necessary resolution you can possibly have with a deeply toxic, abusive family is a massive, impenetrable, 1,000-foot wall of distance. You have to aggressively maintain that strict boundary with the exact same fierce, unrelenting commitment that you once used to finance their comfortable, unearned lives. You absolutely cannot heal your deep wounds in the exact same toxic environment that made you incredibly sick in the first place. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and listening to my story today. If you take absolutely anything away from my long, painful journey, please let it be this: your inherent worth as a human being is absolutely not measured by the size of the checks you write for people who fundamentally do not respect you. Never, ever let anyone, not even your own parents, confidently convince you that you are a beggar in a room that you legally own. Have you ever faced something similar, something this painful, with your own toxic family dynamics? Have you ever had to draw a massive, incredibly painful line in the sand to protect your own peace, your finances, and your sanity? Share your story in the comments below, because your voice matters, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Stay incredibly strong, protect your peace, and always remember, you are the sole author of your own worth.